I'm going to show you everything you need for a DIY backyard chicken setup. Whether this is your first time keeping chickens and you're starting from scratch, or you're already set up and you know what you're doing. From how we built this chicken hoop coop from a kit greenhouse that's going to save you hundreds of dollars, to setting up an automated watering system, through to how we incorporate our chickens in our overall homestead ecosystem. I've been keeping backyard chickens this way for years, and I've learned some really simple, cheap yet effective methods for looking after chickens that's going to keep your chickens healthy, happy and safe. As always, if you find this video useful, please go ahead and give it a thumbs up, and if you want to see more content like this, why not subscribe to the channel. But for now, let's get into the build. All right, so this is the greenhouse we ordered. It's just a 3 by 2 by 2 meter greenhouse. It's basically a hoop. The frames that come in these kit greenhouses are great, but the green plastic will deteriorate in about 6 months. So that's the reason we chuck that and don't use it in the build. Just one thing I forgot to mention in your materials list, a full sheet of 12mm or 1/2 inch plywood. We're going to use a full sheet of this on one end and wrap the shade cloth around to pin to it. That way we're going to be able to cut a swinging door out of our sheet of plywood. Well, we're not quite finished yet. As you can see, no roof, but our little chicks that we've been raising for the last couple of months we're keen to get out of their temporary little cage, and so we've popped them inside. They've got their feet on the ground, which is what they absolutely love. They'll be wanting to scratch around and dig around, so it's not totally secured yet. We're going to have to do some work to get it pinned down to the ground. We're going to get the door cut in the end, and we're going to get some chicken mesh on there to fox-proof it, and of course, that roof. All right, we've just cut the hole in the doorway. So we're adding some hardware, some hinges and some pad bolts. Now, we've learned this lesson the hard way. I've got a barrel bolt on my door up there, but this is the spot that the foxes are going to push on when they come at night. So I'm going to add a second barrel bolt down to the bottom here. The shade cloth is only 1.8 meters and doesn't go all the way to the top, but that's okay. We'll trim the black plastic to suit, which makes for an awesome rain shelter. Well, stage one is complete. We've got the shade cloth on, we've built a front door out of plywood, we've got black plastic on the top to keep the rain out, and we've moved it into place where we want it to go, a nice shady area. What's left to do? We want to add some chicken wire for fox proofing it. I want to pin it down to the ground. We want to add some mulch into the system, and I'll talk about why we do that. We're going to build them a little roosting bar, and we're going to set up an automatic chicken watering system. Make sure to get yourself a packet of these metal button head screws. They are perfect for holding on to the shade cloth, the chicken mesh, and even the black plastic. I just add a little washer that suits that screw so that it doesn't rip the black plastic, and I'm using metal ones. They've got a little cutting tip in them, and that means I can screw straight into that steel frame. For the sections where I've screwed like the shade cloth and the chicken mesh into the plywood, I've used almost the exact same screw but in a timber variety, so it just doesn't have the cutting tip and it's got a coarser thread so that it can hold onto that timber better. Now, I know some of you are looking at this and saying, well, that's not going to keep snakes out, and you're right. That's not my intention. This is just for the foxes and other animals that might want to push through the shade cloth. There is a smaller product you can get called snake and mouse mesh. It's quite a lot more expensive and it could do the job, but from my experience, I've got 3 tips for you for keeping snakes away. Number 1, if you live in the Australian bush like we do, keep your grass short. They don't like being exposed. So whippersnip or mow all around your chicken coop. Number 2, don't put baby chickens in here. They cheep a lot and that's going to attract the snakes, especially at night time. And number 3, keep it clean. It's the rodents that attract the snakes more than the chickens. So if you've got food scraps and old food in there, that's going to attract rodents. Rodents are going to attack snakes. If you do those 3 things, the snakes are hardly ever going to visit your chickens. We're inside the coop now and we're going to work on getting it pinned down to the ground. Number 1, this is a pretty light structure, so I don't want the wind blowing it away, but also because it's light, I don't want an animal to get their nose under there and potentially lift it up. Now you might say, what about digging? Well, pinning it down to the ground is going to help with that, but the second thing that we've done to mitigate that problem is we've got our chicken coop right up near our house. Now we're on a farm and we do have farm dogs nearby. They will smell and hear what's going on just outside and alert us to any activity. An animal's going to take some time to dig through there. So that's the first thing you could do. The second thing you could do, and we've done this in the past, so it might be a future upgrade that we do to this coop, is we buy some 200 by 50 mil sleepers and we pin the whole thing or screw straight through that steel frame into the sleepers. That gives it a nice heavy base and makes it a whole lot harder to dig through. I'm using these metal sand pegs. You can buy them at your camping store or some hardware stores. They've got a nice big lip on them and that's going to fit nicely over our steel frame. Let's talk about flooring and what you're going to put on the surface of this chicken coop depending on how you're going to keep your chickens. You've got two options. So first of all, if your chickens are going to be spending their entire time in here, we need to consider their health and welfare. And the first thing is disease. You could use a hard surface, so you could make a timber deck of some kind, you could use some pavers, you could even do a concrete pad. What you're going to have to do is wash out that chicken coop on a regular basis. You don't want those chickens going through their own manure. Hopefully you'd also be feeding and watering them well up off the ground, but at the end of the day, they're pooping on the ground and they're spending time on that same ground. So that's something you need to consider. I've got a solution for that and I'll talk about that in just a moment. Now, if your chickens are going to be 100% free range, in other words, they're only spending the night in here and then they always come out first thing in the morning, then you really don't need to worry too much about the surface. So you could do either of the methods that we're suggesting, as long as, again, you're occasionally cleaning out that coop to make sure you're keeping on top of those disease vectors. Or you could do it the way we're going to do it, and that's a little bit 50-50. Now, I believe that free-range chickens create the healthiest, most nutritious and delicious eggs. If you've ever cracked open an egg from a free-range chicken, you'll know that yolk is not yellow, it's almost orange. So we want our chickens to spend some time outdoors, and yet they're going to be spending some time in this coop scratching around. So I'm concerned about them scratching around and eating from the very same surface that they're pooping on. So we're going to use a mulch system. Now this is just mulch that we ran through our wood chipper, and so it's some branches and leaves and things, and it's a really fine mulch. The chickens love it. I can just tip this in here in one big huge pile, and within a day or two that'll be spread out flat because the chickens are going to love going through this looking for some yummy treats. This is going to help with two things. First of all, it's going to integrate the manure further down deep, and so they're not going to be spending as much time pecking through their own manure. But secondly, I'm going to scrape this out of here about every 2 weeks, and I'm going to use it in my garden system. I'm going to include this mulch that's been in here for a couple of weeks, that's now infused with that high nitrogen chicken manure into my compost pile, and then once that's processed through my compost pile, that's going to be excellent for my garden. So it's going to keep my chickens healthier, it's going to keep my chickens happier. It's certainly the system I would recommend, whether you're keeping them in here permanently, half the time, or even if you're totally free ranging them, you're going to get some really great benefits from using mulch. You could use wood chip mulch like we're using. You could use straw. It tends to get a little bit stinkier over time. You could even just take your rake and rake up some leaves and use some kind of like forest floor type mulch. Anything like that's going to work to soak up that manure and give the chickens a healthier, happier experience. Let's talk about roosting. You've got two considerations because a chicken is not naturally a roosting animal, and yet there are some advantages in training it to do so. A chicken in the wild, if you think about the original chicken, was a forest floor dwelling animal. And if you've ever observed new chickens in a coop, you'll find they all huddle together on the floor in the corner of the chicken coop. That's their natural behavior. But there's some advantages to teaching them how to roost as long as you understand that's not their natural behavior. So first consideration is you're going to have to train them. Now that can mean coming out night after night and putting them up on the roosting bars until they get it. It can take a couple of weeks to do that. Or, and this is the method I prefer, start with a roosting bar that's down close to the ground. Some of them are naturally going to hop up on that roosting bar, especially if you've got a rooster. He's going to do that for the dominance position that it holds. And then some of the other chickens are going to learn from that behavior and do it too. Of course, the advantage of having your chickens up high is predators. So we don't want our chickens down on the ground because of disease, but we also don't want them down on the ground overnight because potentially if something gets in the coop, at least they've got a fighting chance being up high. Now, I've cut some branches and that's our second consideration. I want to consider their feet. If they're not naturally a roosting or a branch gripping animal, which they're not, then you don't want to give them a small piece of timber which is going to have their claws curled around it all night long. That's not their natural foot position and you're going to do some damage to your chicken's feet. So you want a nice wide branch, something that's just slightly smaller than their feet. So they can grip it, they're not having to balance flat on it, but they're mostly just standing on it flat and using that awesome balance that they have to balance on that roost. They're not just gripping a small, like a piece of dowel. That would be a horrible roost for them. So natural is better. Cut some nice thick branches if you can. I'm gonna make a roost that sits nice and low to the ground, just a simple A-frame device. And then over time, I'm actually gonna raise that roost up and we're gonna mount it up higher in our chicken coop once our chickens have been trained. Well, that's it, just a simple A-frame. My main branch on top there is nice and wide. In fact, it goes from small to wide, and so it's going to suit a variety of chicken feet sizes. Another device you definitely want to consider, especially if your chickens are going to be permanently inside their coop, is an auto waterer with a constant supply of water. So you're going to need some of these waterer nipples. They're a simple little device that when the chickens push on them, it opens up the back, which is inside the bucket or the barrel, and lets water out. When they stop pushing on them, it stops the water flowing out. If you want this to be constant water supply where you don't have to check on it almost ever, then you're also going to want a float control device, and that simply sits in the water. As the water level raises, it shuts that little valve in there, stops it from overflowing, but as it drops, it lets the water back through, and so it's constantly filling up. They'll never run out of water. If you've kept chickens before, you know that's one of the worst things that can happen is for them to run out of water. I'm going to use this old 50-litre barrel that I had lying around. Number one, because it's got a lid and it's fairly sturdy. I'm also going to add to the outside of it a way to connect my water supply, and I'm just using 10mm black irrigation line. So I've got a 10mm barb fitting that's going to screw onto the end of that float control valve. We're going to drill some holes in the bottom and put a couple of nipples in at the right height. That's going to give the chickens a constant water supply. Well, there you have it, our DIY backyard chicken setup. If you were to buy all of this off the shelf, you would have spent hundreds, if not thousands of dollars. All up, this project cost us less than $350, and that includes buying everything, yes, even the screws. Right now, our chickens are just freeloaders. They're not yet of egg laying age. As soon as we get that first egg, we'll pop in a little box and start teaching them to lay in a nesting box. So, nesting boxes are on the agenda for future upgrades, which includes a timber base frame and an automated door. But for now, we've got a chicken coop and setup that's lightweight, that's mobile, that's safe and secure, but most of all, the chickens love it.